Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today I'm going to give kind of a brief rundown on the Unifi controller itself and kind of compare it to past versions, what's changed, what hasn't. Pretty much since I've started using Unifi equipment, I think there's been like 4 complete interface overhauls, and it seems like some of these settings are extremely hard to find now, and it seems like everything changes places almost every year. So I'm going to try and clear up some of the confusion as well as point out some configurations that you may or may not lose out on in which version you're using. But first, I'm going to just kind of go into a brief overview of the controller itself, what settings you can really care about and which ones you really can't. And for this overview, I am going to be using at least almost the latest version of the Unifi controller, which is this right here. This is version 7.1.65. I know they are on version 7.2 something at this point. Hopefully there hasn't been too many extremely major changes in that version. But let's just kind of dive into the main settings that you should concern yourself with. And all of that is going to be under the settings pane. And you can see here with the newer interface, we've got basically 3 main configuration areas: Wi-Fi, networks, and internet. And these all kind of go in line with what line of equipment you have from Unifi. So with Unifi, you've got like security gateways and dream machines, which are designated as gateways, basically. You've got switches, and you've got wireless access points. Those are your 3 main categories. So depending on which ones you're setting up is going to depend which one of these menus you're really going to concern yourself with. And I think for the most part, most people are going to be using Unifi access points, so the Wi-Fi area is probably where you're going to spend most of your time. So when you want to create a new wireless network, or your first one, you click Create Wireless Network, you give it a name and a password for the SSID, and the rest of these options are pretty much default. So with these newer versions of Unifi controllers, I feel like they're trying to make it a lot more simple, easier to get off the ground. It's not trying to bombard you with as many options. However, as a network administrator, that can kind of have the opposite effect on you, where you're wondering where those options went, why you don't have as much flexibility as you want. For the everyday person who really just wants to deploy Wi-Fi, I think this is going in kind of the right direction, but for those of us who are really down in the weeds with this stuff, it kind of makes us second guess ourselves, because why don't we have all these options? But here for Wi-Fi, you pretty much give it a name, you give it a password. By default, it defaults to the default network. That's a lot of defaults. We'll get to this in a second on when you can change that, but really this is just your whatever network the access point is on, plugged into, that's the network that this SSID is going to have access to. If you only have one network and you're deploying Wi-Fi, don't worry about that at all. The section on broadcasting APs, you can ignore this unless you have multiple access points and you have different wireless networks that you want different access points to advertise. So if you only have one, the default of all APs should be just fine. Now, the rest of this is set to auto, but if we change that over to manual, we can tweak a lot of these options. You really don't need to if you're just deploying Wi-Fi quickly, but just scrolling through these options, you might notice there is no VLAN designator. That's one of the common things that we like to do with these wireless networks is, say you have your primary network, which is basically all default. It's on the default network, your internal LAN. But you also want to have like a guest or some other kind of network which is going to be tagged with a VLAN tag. At some point in the past, Unifi switched from having that set under the wireless network itself to having it configured under an actual network. Now I'm going to leave. I'm not going to save those changes. But basically, these networks are what determine the VLAN now, instead of the actual wireless networks. So when you create a wireless network, you tie it to basically a physical network, which is configured here. So if we create a new network, we can give it the name again, and then here you can select the router that it's a part of. We can't select one because we don't have a router in our controller. This is another one of those newer features where if you have a security gateway configured, you just select that and it'll configure the rest of these options around it. Now to get an actual VLAN network, we just check VLAN only network, give it a VLAN ID of whatever we want, and then we add that network. So then now when we're creating our wireless network, when we come in and select a different network, we will scroll down to the VLAN only of test network that we created, and that's how we actually assign a VLAN tag to a wireless network. Now the internet tab, let's leave. This is pretty much only for security gateways and Dream Machines. This is where you would configure basically your WAN interface of whatever gateway you have. Also, one note, you can only have one gateway adopted per site. So if you have more than one Dream Machine or more than one security gateway, you are not going to be able to adopt it into the same site. The controller will only recognize one gateway device per site. And when I'm talking about sites, I mean these things over here. If you click on your account bubble, you can add a new site, import a site, or select an existing one. And pretty much all these are distinct instances of the controller. They have their own network configuration, their own wireless network configuration, their own internet configuration. And if we look here at the regular settings menu, basically everything above system is going to be specific to a site. The system configurations are global. It controls the entire controller. But if we look at our tabs, internet, we got nothing. Networks, we have all of these. Wireless networks, we got those. But then we select a different site and go to settings. Now we have different wireless networks, different networks. Internet's still the same because I don't have any gateways on any of this. But the same would also be true for VPN, traffic management, firewall and security, and I believe it should be, it's specific to profiles as well. Now, speaking of all of these other menus, like profiles, this is the menu that you're really only going to concern yourself with if you are configuring a Unifi switch. So if you think of switch configuration in like the terms of a Cisco world, access ports, trunk ports, you're assigning a VLAN to a port on a switch. Like say you want port 1 to be only a part of VLAN 10, you want port 8 to be your trunk, tagging VLANs 1, 10, and 20. That is where profiles come in. And to create a profile, you just give it a name, say, well, all's a default one, but say we have a voice network. We select whether we want it to have PoE or not and which type we want it to have. Now the native network, this is basically where you tie it in. So we'll say 99 is going to be our voice VLAN. And if we want it to only be a part of that VLAN, we don't select any tagged networks. But if we want it to be a trunk and we want it to have that VLAN as well as 76, then here we would be creating a profile where the port itself is on VLAN 99, but it's going to tag any traffic for VLAN 76. Now, a very common way to use this is to have data and voice. So what I do is I call it like data plus voice. And what we would do is have the native network as default, the tagged network. Actually, we're not going to select any. We're going to select the voice network of 99. And that basically automatically says that it's a tagged network of 99. And the rest of this really can be left alone. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of that. You can see I have some switch ports and profiles already created. I don't believe any of these are custom. Every time you create a new network, it also creates a new switch port profile because you can directly assign a switch port to a network. But when you want to start mixing and matching untagged and tagged in different ways that are not a part of the default configuration, then that is where you want to make new port profiles. And the rest of this we're not going to get into. I rarely ever touch it. Firewall and security, you're only going to concern yourself with, again, if you have a security gateway or a Dream Machine. Same with traffic management, and also the same with VPN. So just kind of backtrack a little bit. Internet, VPN, traffic management, firewall, and security, these are all pretty much specific to if you have a gateway. These really aren't going to make any difference on your wireless access points or your switches because they don't have those features. However, because you can manage gateway devices with the controller, these are there as options. And another one that's kind of specific to gateways is when you're creating the new network. You can see, we already did this like a few seconds ago, but you can see we have the gateway IP, the broadcast IP, usable IPs, and you have this auto scale option. You can pretty much ignore all of this if you're making the new network because these are settings for a gateway. If you don't have a Dream Machine or security gateway, then this isn't going to configure DHCP or these networks on anything at all because those devices aren't there. So like here, if we switch it to manual, you can see we have DHCP mode, we can have a server, we can have a relay, or none. But these settings are only going to apply to a gateway device. So you can ignore them if you don't have one. Now, just a couple other overviews on this newer controller. There's the Insights tab. This is pretty much where you go for historical data. If you have an always-on controller, that is preferable for this interface because you can see different statistics over different time periods. And this is also one of those areas that apparently has changed at some point because used to in the Insights tab you could see like rogue access points, neighboring access points, client history, all kinds of different ones. Maybe you still can, but just coming in here and looking, I don't see the option to change what data I want to look at. Right now it's just on Wi-Fi scan and we're seeing all the different Wi-Fi networks. And if I go to display options, I can really only change between 2.4 and 5 gigahertz or show all Wi-Fi. I don't really have any other options, which previously have been available here. Statistics tab are pretty much just graphs, like traffic usage and wireless statistics, like signal levels, whatever. Sometimes this can be useful. The client devices is basically Unifi's version of a MAC address table. You won't find a MAC address table on any of these devices, even the switches, unless you SSH into them. And even then, I think it's a little weird how they do their address tables. So we kind of rely on this client devices tab to match up IPs to MAC addresses, which even by default, it doesn't show. We got to go to display options, go to columns, and show MAC address. So this is actually one of my biggest complaints about the controller is the lack of a MAC address table or really any way to pinpoint where a device is on the network. The Devices tab is the most self-explanatory. This is where your access points, switches, or gateway devices show up. They all show up here. And then you've got your topology, which is just a nice visual of access point switches, whatever, and the clients. And then, of course, you have the dashboard, which this is the newest one. You can show how many wireless devices you have and what wireless protocol they're using. Quick view of your most active clients and your Wi-Fi experience graph, which is pretty much a number of how well your wireless network is performing, basically by signal levels. So now that we've had a quick rundown of the actual controller, let's go back in time and see the different versions. So what I have here is this new one, which is on 7.165. I also have this one, which is running 6 dot something. This one, which is running 5 dot something, but with the newer interface. You can see they're pretty similar, except for the left panel here. You can see when I switch between the two. And then this last one is the earliest version I could download from Unifi, which is, I think, 5.6. But we can almost think of this as like version 7, 6, 5. And we can kind of call this 4, even though it's not. But it is a different interface. So this, I think, is where a lot of people get confused. Because if you installed your Unifi network 3 years ago and you're still running the same version of the controller, and then you want to look up a video on how to change configurations or something, you never know what interface you're looking at. Like your interface you have is different than the one the guy's showing you on in the video. And then you go back to that video a couple years later, and that interface is different than your new one that you updated to. So aside from the MAC address table stuff, this is also my main complaint about Unifi software is just how often and how substantial the changes are. So let's go ahead and bring up the settings menu of each of these. So on this oldest one, that's down here, same place, settings. And it looks pretty similar to kind of the older menu that most of us are probably used to. It's not that crazy. Now, this did actually look even more different in previous versions, but this was the oldest one I could get. Now in version 5.16, I think this is. Let's go to settings. It's at the bottom, and it's got this disgusting new version of network that I'd actually never seen before. Well, I said network, version of settings. This was kind of 5. Let me just confirm what version this is on. I don't remember. 5.14. So this is 5.14's attempt at a new interface. I'd never used it before, but it looks like a hot pile of garbage to me. Looks completely different than all the others. So where this was your settings menu in the oldest one, this is now your settings menu in 5.14. And then you update to 6 dot something, and here's your settings menu again, which is more similar to the even older one. So this is just kind of, I guess they tried it and then threw it out the window. And this one I actually think is using the legacy interface as well, which is another thing that you can do in a lot of these controllers is switch between one interface and another. Basically, you have a legacy interface and a new interface. So, yep, this one's actually using the legacy interface of 6 dot whatever. So if we enable new user interface and apply, now it completely changes everything. We go back to the settings menu, and now it is more similar to our version 7 interface. But you can see we have even less options, where in version 7 we have Wi-Fi networks, internet, VPN, traffic management, firewall, profiles and system. Here in the new interface of 6, we have Wi-Fi networks and internet, and then traffic security notifications, advanced features, and systems. So you have even less menus to kind of find your stuff in. So if you want to create a wireless network here, yeah, let's add a new wireless network. Basically, we have the same fields as version 7, but the rest of it's kind of hidden. So new, give it a password, whatever. The rest of your configurations are done under advanced, and to me, they're actually even uglier to look at than version 7. But let's move back to version 5.14 or whatever and try to use this menu. See, Wi-Fi networks. Let's create a new one. What do we want? We want basic or advanced. All right, basic. All we have is a name. Test network. Next. Do we want a password protected or not? Yeah. What's the password? No option for web WPA, WPA2. Just as basic as you can get. And that's it. You got the name and you got the password. Cool. Let's see what advanced gives us. Ooh, I have never seen this menu before, but all of our regular options are still here somewhere. Got test 2. Here we can actually select our security protocol. Since WPA, personal, enterprise, or open, those are our only options. We can put in our password. We got our network access stuff. Here is where we can select the client group. Here we go. Hidden is where we can use a VLAN. And we got this weird slider thing. This is trash. So if we want VLAN 30, and now again, you might notice we're creating a wireless network. And in this version, the VLAN ID is under the wireless network, not under our networks. So this gets super confusing. Let's go one version back to this one and create our wireless network. And this is probably the menu that most of us are probably the most familiar with, where we give it the name, we enable it, WPA personal, put in our password, and then we expand our guest settings. And if we want a VLAN, we can put in the VLAN. And then change the more advanced options if we wish, like the rate controls, the MAC filter. Most of any configuration you want for a wireless network is here under the wireless network that you're creating. Now that might just be me talking because I have the most experience in a setup or a menu like this, but just the fact that it's changed this much over time is kind of ridiculous. And even the way that you switch between the new and old menus changes as well. So in this 5.6, there's actually not a new or a legacy interface here at all. This is the only interface it has. Which, by the way, if you want to switch sites, that's in the top right of these older ones, not on the left. But in 5.14, we do have the option for a different interface. And they actually put it here at the top. Can't find what you need? Switch to classic mode. Which is probably where you're going to go, because this has all the stuff that is so similar to the older version. Even creating the wireless network on this same version has a completely different menu. And here again, we can still assign the VLAN in version 5.14. Now let's move up to 6. If we go to System, we'll leave. I have unsafe changes. And toggle off this new user interface and hit deactivate. Then we go back and we have the menu that looks basically the same as the last ones. So this is why people use the legacy interface the most, because you can see it is kind of the most consistent one across all the versions, 5.6, 5.14, and then 6 something. But even in 6, if we go to the wireless networks and add a wireless network, we no longer have the VLAN option. So this is somewhere between 5.14 and 6.4. They removed the VLAN assignment from under the wireless. So you have to select the network and you have to make your VLAN under a new network, which also has all of these crazy options that show up as yellow. And all this means is it says USW required, so this one requires a switch. And while it says Unifi switch required, it's actually not. It's any switch that can recognize VLANs. But VPN client, site-to-site VPN, they do require a security gateway or a Dream Machine. But at least here it labels which options are kind of, optional depending on the device. So I did like that. Now, let's move up to version 7 and go to System and see where our interface option is. Oh, here it is. They changed it from a toggle switch and use new interface to a checkbox that enables the legacy interface. So, yeah, let's deactivate the new interface. And now we're basically back to the old classic one, which looks very similar across all of them, although like we've seen with the wireless network configuration, there are actually settings that have moved around, even though the menus look very similar. In version 7 and 6, you have to create the network for the VLAN, and in version 5 and before, you put the VLAN under the wireless network. So what does all this really mean? This has pretty much just been myself complaining about the fact that this controller has updated over time, although everything updates over time. Look at your iPhone if you have one. Every time there's a new iOS, your settings change places. Everything goes to a new location and you can't find it. So really, what's gotten better? Well, I think some things have got better. I like how they're trying to make it easier to get off the ground. However, like I said before, a lot of us who like these advanced features and like to have complete control over everything kind of turns us off when there's only 2 options to configure and the rest is just considered default or hidden in an advanced menu somewhere. But for those of us who just want to deploy a wireless network quickly, I think it is a lot easier with the newer interfaces. Because when some of us just want to deploy a single access point and then we go to configure a network and we get all of these options and we're like, I don't know, do I need this? Do I not need this? It is kind of nice when you can just go new interface, settings, networks, new network, and it's a little more guided. All you got to do is put in a name. Do you want a VLAN? Do you not want a VLAN? Whatever, that's really all you need to put in is the name and if you want a VLAN. The rest of this, it says is advanced, and you can change it if you want. That is pretty nice. But if I'm wanting to fine-tune stuff the way I always have, I'm probably going to use the legacy interface since as we've already seen, it goes back over multiple versions and everything's more or less in the same spot. So I know that this video didn't really teach anything at all. It was kind of more me venting about the different versions of the controller, which is not really the intention I had for the video. I really wanted to go into just a basic overview of the controller and then be like, hey, it's changed in the past few versions, but it really just turned into me complaining that I have to click in different areas for different things. But some of this I think is good to know, like the fact that the VLAN configuration changed spots between version 5 and 6, that even the way you enable or disable the new user interfaces have changed. Like we're used to in version 5.14, you used to have this try new settings thing at the top and switch to classic mode at the top. Like, look how fast I can go between the 2 different menus. Boom, boom, boom. But in the new one, I got to go to System. I got to look for that little legacy interface. I got to toggle it. I got to hit deactivate. Reloads the whole thing. And once I'm in the legacy one, then getting back, that location has changed as well. We got to go to user interface instead of System. And then we have to toggle the thing for new user interface. Hit apply. And now we're back. So it's just some stuff to be aware of, and I do realize that if you just kept your controller up to date, you really wouldn't have to worry about that too much. But also at the same time, if you keep your controller up to date, all your settings are constantly moving. So It's a double-edged sword. Anyways, I think I've rambled on long enough in this video that's pretty much pointless. So if you learned something, then awesome. If you didn't, I don't blame you. I didn't really teach anything. But as always, happy networking.